Morning, everybody. Still morning. Welcome to our first annual meeting of 2020 in the era of COVID. We have a very exciting program to do today, but before we start, we need to get done with some business that is required as for all of our meetings. But before we get to that, I want to say a few words about this week. It is very fitting today that we have a discussion on racism, given what's going on in the country, especially with what happened with Breonna Taylor's case yesterday. Also, Erev Rosh Hashanah, we lost an American hero, a heroine, one of my idols. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is responsible for many of the rights that we and our daughters and our granddaughters enjoy today. There's a post that I posted on my Facebook page today about the Odd Couple, and it's something we can all learn from the two of them. It was Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, who were great friends, even though they were ideologically different. And you have to think about intellect and friendship and what you see in people and humanity when you decide how you're going to live your life and what you're going to do. So I dedicate today's program to Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, the Odd Couple, who in their own way fought for all the rights that we enjoy today and hope we can continue to enjoy in the future. That being said, I'm officially opening this meeting. We have two pieces of business to handle this morning. One is we have to approve the minutes from last year's opening meeting, and you all received a copy of those minutes when you registered for the meeting. I would like a motion to approve the minutes and a second. Shannon has moved to approve them.
Second.
And Claudette has seconded. The minutes stand approved as presented. The next course of business that we have to approve today is every 3 years, our chapter is responsible for reviewing our bylaws and redoing them. The bylaws committee has gone to great work over the summer to complete a review and revision of our bylaws. They have been sent out to the board for approval, the executive committee for approval, and the general membership who have voted on it and received emails back from them approving them. As a formality, this is the opening meeting of the general membership, so the bylaws need to be approved. I need a motion from the membership to approve the bylaws.
Approve.
Second?
Second.
The bylaws for 2020-2023 now stand approved. The next process will be, they will be sent to national, and then a copy will be sent to every board member for their files. Thank you very much for the business portion of today's meeting. And now I'd like to turn it over to Karen Edelstein, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. You're muted, Karen. Unmute Karen, somebody.
I'm doing my best.
I'm unmuted.
Yes,
All
you
right.
are.
I'll try again. Good morning. Carol Francois is a lifetime educator with over 30 years experience in the field, who uses learning as a catalyst for positive change. Carol says that she began her career in education at age 3, teaching her dolls on the doorsteps of her home. Since that career started, she has served in a variety of roles, including Chief of Staff for the Dallas Independent School District, Associate Superintendent, Commissioner of Education for the state of Texas, Assistant Superintendent in Wake County Public Schools, Department Director at Regional Education Service Center, Director of Learning for an International Education Association, as well as a grade level principal and dean of instruction in 2 large urban school districts. Dr. Francois says that education and learning are in my DNA, and my goal is to use my skills for the betterment of the world. Carol is a lifelong learner, and for those of us who have had the pleasure of working with Carol, she makes us want to learn as well. And among the many things she has taught us are that one must put in the work in our journey of learning, and when confronting systemic racism, and I'm sure you'll hear it from her again today, one must see it, say it, and confront it. I'm happy to turn this over to my longtime friend and grad school pal, Dr. Carol Francois. And Carol, before you get started, can you enlighten us about why are they so angry got started and your journey there?
Well, Karen, good morning, and good morning to everyone. I'm pleased to be here, and just listening to you rattle through all the jobs I've had, I'm tired, and I'm glad I'm retired now. So, but it has been a great journey, 30 plus years. But why are they so angry get started? So let me tell you a little bit about it. And it actually relates to what we're experiencing this very day. Back on May 31st, I woke up to the bad news about George Floyd having been killed. And I'm a gardener, and I was very grieved by what I heard. And the only thing I knew to do at that moment was to actually make a little memorial in my garden to George Floyd, and on behalf of all the people who have died at the hands of law enforcement. And the second thing I thought about was, again, as an educator, maybe I can tell people something that would help them through and to understand what is happening in this country. And for the last 20 years or so, my husband and I have been collecting books about systemic racism in America. And in collecting those books, we've been sharing them with our friends, with our family, and in fact, with our nieces and nephews when they see us coming. It's sort of like, oh, please, not another book, Carol. But I picked up a book years ago entitled The Education of Blacks in the South, 1865 to 1938. And being an educator, I was intrigued. I wanted to see what that was all about. Well, the more I read, the more I understood that I did not understand about how education had been formed and molded in this country through the lens of systemic racism in order to actually keep Black African Americans subjugated. So I started that journey. Well, where does that take us with those books? Well, I have a collection of books, many books about different institutions in America and how systemic racism plays into those. And so I decided the morning after I heard about George Floyd's death to post that list of books on my Facebook page. And I suggested to people, hey, look, if you're wondering how we got to where we are now, read some of these books and you'll get a better understanding of how these things have come to be. Well, lo and behold, a couple of people saw the list and said, you ought to do a book study. You ought to lead us through reading these books. And I kind of laughed it off and thought, oh no. And then I mentioned it to my friends and some of my family members, and they said, yes, you ought to do that. And so the next thing I knew, I put up a Facebook group and opened it up to friends and others who might be interested. And within 1 week's time, almost 200 people had signed up and asked to join the private Facebook group to learn more about systemic racism. Well, since then, fast forward about 3 months, we now have a public Facebook page, a Instagram, a LinkedIn page, a website. What else do we have? Oh, I'm finishing up, getting ready to open up the online course called Systemic Racism, See It, Say It, Confront It. And a number of other things. It's just become, I don't even know how to describe this. It's taken on a life of its own. And so that's how Why Are They So Angry started with just a Facebook group and now has turned into this amazing project where I get the opportunity, along with my niece, Courtney Square, to share what we have learned and what we continue to learn about systemic racism in this country. Oh, and by the way, we have a podcast. And the podcast is also called Why Are They So Angry? And that podcast, in fact, we've already done 7 episodes. And if you're interested, the podcast is up on Apple Podcasts, and you can find it there under, again, the name Why Are They So Angry? So Karen, thank you for asking me about how I got started and why we are sharing this information with you today. I am very pleased to be with all of you on this call because this is, as I hope you can see, it's a very important topic and it's near and dear to my heart. I want to start with a poem by Richard Wright. And it reads this way. If you've read the book that I suggested you read before this session, you probably saw the poem in the book, The Warmth of Other Suns. And the poem goes this way. I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant it in alien soil to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains and bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. And that is Richard Wright speaking about his experience of moving from the South to the North and the desire to grow and feel something different than the subjugation he felt in the South. So for you today, it may seem a bit odd to begin a book discussion or begin a discussion at all about systemic racism by asking you to read a book by Isabel Wilkerson, and a book that chronicles what has become to be known as the Great Migration. But even if that doesn't feel odd to you, you may actually even be wondering why I didn't choose her latest book. That's the highly lauded book titled Caste. And it is a good book. It's an excellent book, and I suggest that you all read it. But to me, the stories that Wilkerson tells of the 3 migrants, Ida Mae Gladney, George Starling, and Robert Pershing Foster, those stories about those 3 people encapsulates the problem of systemic racism in America, especially since their stories take us into the past, into the history, where there is the fertile ground where the seeds of systemic racism were sown, as well as the anger that Black African Americans have developed as a result. I firmly believe that it's imperative we know the entire history of America, not the sanitized school book version, to understand why America looks and feels the way it does today. If you've been reading your history or taking all of your history merely from those books way back in the past when you were in high school, you only got a sliver of American history. These 3 people then, for me, represent the 6 million Black African Americans who, over the span of 70 years, literally voted with their feet to try to leave systemic racism behind. Now, migration stories are as old as man and womankind alike. When situations become untenable, people become willing to leave their homelands and flee to foreign soil to, as Richard Wright says, transplant in alien soil. And I am certain many of you and your families have your own migration stories, stories about relatives who left their countries, their homelands, looking for a better life, left searching for employment. They left trying to escape persecution or even death. And my own family has a migration story, but I never knew that we had a migration story until I read The Warmth of Other Suns, and I'll tell a little bit about that later. But the irony of the 6 million migrants in it's not a novel, in the true epic story of the Great Migration, the irony of those migrants in that book is that they were seeking a better life. They were searching for employment. They were escaping persecution and death in their own country. That's what is so incredibly important for us to understand. Imagine that. Ida Mae, George, and Robert left the South and moved to the North, to the Midwest, and to the West to escape persecution in their own country. And what created that need for escape is, and in some situations is systemic racism. So let's get the definition in our minds right now about what systemic racism is. Systemic racism is actually their patterns, their procedures, their practices, and their policies that operate within social institutions. And those procedures, policies, practices, and so on are consistently designed to penalize, disadvantage, and exploit individuals who are members of non-white racial ethnic groups. Now, the major American institutions that we see systemic racism running through, and all of them, but the main ones that I often talk about include education, business and labor, criminal justice, housing, and healthcare. These are areas where we see systemic racism on a daily basis. Now, The Warmth of Other Suns describes the decades of systemic racism that led George, Ida Mae, and Robert to join that Southern exodus. And it's also the impetus that's fueling the outpouring of frustration, anxiety, and the feelings of helplessness most Black African Americans are feeling every day. And as Elaine pointed out, even today. The situation that we are reading in the news about the Breonna Taylor case is an example of the criminal justice system exhibiting systemic racism. So let me talk a little bit about some people who have described what systemic racism is. And the scholar Kehaulani Kahani says, racism is a system, not an event. It's that nebulous web that's interwoven into social institutions that seems to invisibly affect how the races interact in America. Now, Ida Mae, George, and Robert are each exemplars of Black African Americans living within institutions contorted by systemic racism. So we're going to take a look at each one and see which particular institution that individual was living through and how systemic racism was impacting them. In Ida Mae's case, hers is a story about systemic racism in labor. Now, Ida Mae was born into the post-Civil War system of the Black codes and sharecropping. So if you don't know about Black codes, let me tell you a little bit what those were. These were very strict local and state laws that told when and where and how formerly enslaved people could work and for how much pay. These codes cropped up throughout the South as a legal way to put the formerly enslaved into indentured servitude. It was also a way to take away their voting rights and to control where they lived, how they traveled. It even allowed for seizing men, women, and even children for forced labor. So if you were like Ida Mae in the early 30s, 20s and 30s of this country, and you were a Black African American person, and you were living in the South, you were living under laws that purposely were intended to put you back into slavery. Now, sharecropping was also, it was nothing more than legalized enslavement. If you've read the book, you know that Ida Mae was a sharecropper, and she never could make her 100-pound quota, unfortunately. And that's part of the reason why she made her escape from the South. But conceptually, sharecroppers were supposed to farm the land for the person who owned the land. And the intent would be at the end of the season, they would split or share the profits in some way. I don't know if they necessarily supposed to split the profits 50-50, probably not. But there was supposed to be a profit to go to the sharecropper who actually farmed the land. Well, the truth is, it often resulted in sharecroppers owing more to the landowners for the use of the tools and supplies that they had to buy from the landowner. Also, the contracts between the landowners and the sharecroppers were typically very harsh and very, very restrictive. The contracts usually forbade the sharecropper from saving cotton seeds from their harvest. And the reason that was done was to force them to actually increase their debt to the landowner, because the sharecroppers would have to in turn buy the cotton seed from the landowner. And the landowners almost always, without exception, charged very, very high interest rates on anything that the sharecroppers purchased. So when you had that kind of situation going on, getting out of debt or even making a profit was the chances were pretty slim. So Ida Mae's escape to Chicago was intended to offer her freedom from the bondage of the exploitative sharecropping, where she never managed to meet that quota for picking cotton. Now, once in Chicago, though, she and her husband were still doomed in the labor market because they had to take low paying and low skilled jobs, because that's all that was really open to Black African Americans at the time. And if you know your history of unions, moving to Chicago, moving to the area where there were many of the jobs, there were industrial jobs, the slaughterhouses and so on. The few people there were unionized, and Black African Americans were not allowed to join the unions. That was later, but even then it was still problematic. Now, today, the legacy of the systematic racism in labor continues. For example, Black unemployment rates are higher than the national average. In 2019, the overall, for the entire country, the overall employment rate was 3.7%. The unemployment rate for Blacks is 6.1%. Also, the country's most highly educated Black African American workers are still less likely to be employed than their white counterparts. And when they are employed, they are less likely to be employed in a job that is consistent with their level of education, which strongly suggests that racial discrimination remains a major failure of an otherwise tight labor market that we have experienced, not right now, but in the past. I don't know how 2020 is going to look, but my suspicion is that labor numbers for Black African Americans in 2020 are going to look dismal as well. Now, George Starling's story is another view of systemic racism. His view is actually a view of systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Now, from the Civil War until the mid-20th century, lynch mobs were a type of criminal justice regularly practiced against Black African American men and women. Now, mobs would form under the pretext of administering justice without trial, and ultimately the accused was tortured and mutilated before hanging. In her book, Wilkerson writes that across the South, someone was hanged or burned every 4 days from 1889 to 1929. Imagine that, every day. And Brian Stevenson, the famed lawyer and the author of Just Mercy, documented over 4,400 lynchings done between 1877 and 1950. That's not that long ago. And he has recorded and memorialized them at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, in George's case, because he had the audacity to try and organize the citrus pickers, if you'll recall that, he tried very hard to get those citrus pickers to get together and demand higher wages from the orchard owners. Well, when he tried to do that, he became a marked man. And it was very clear that his fate was going to be lynching. So George fled for his life to New York City. And even after taking a job as a Pullman porter, traveling north and south along the Atlantic seaboard, he had to be careful not to be spotted by Southern men who had marked him for death. So the idea of running for your life, fleeing for your life to avoid extrajudicial punishment through lynching was not unusual based on those numbers that I just shared with you. Now, let's fast forward up to today. Earlier this year, the quick succession of Black African-American deaths in less than a month's time, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, are actually haunting reminders of lynch mobs and extrajudicial authority. Even this very day, protesters are decrying the unequal justice that's been meted out to the police officers who murdered Breonna Taylor. So getting beyond systemic racism in the criminal justice system is probably not going to happen unless we speak up. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is healthcare. And healthcare is no exception to systemic racism. And we look at Robert Foster's story to highlight that. You'll recall from the book, when Robert's brother fell ill, he insisted on taking over his medical care. Now, Robert feared his brother would not get the type of care he needed in that small town where they grew up at a hospital in Louisiana. He was very concerned. So he had his brother brought out to California where he could care for him. Well, history tells us that Robert's fears were justified. Beginning as far back as colonial times, enslaved people were regularly used as specimens to try out surgical techniques, often without anesthetic, to try out transplants and risky medical treatments, as well as experimental medications. For example, when scientists began testing the powers of the atom during the 1950s, Black African-American men were subjected to medical experiments, such as injecting them with high doses of plutonium to see how their organs would react. It just gives me the chills to think about that, and I hope it does you too. Now, even children haven't been safe. Black African-American children, particularly young boys, have been administered experimental drugs, given unnecessary surgeries, including brain surgery, and psychological abuses, most of these done without parental consent or consent that had been coerced. Now, currently, several studies detail another danger to Black African Americans, and that is the prevalence of what is known as implicit bias in healthcare. Researchers looked at 4 academic medical centers across the country and evaluated physicians who self-reported no explicit preference for white versus Black patients. However, after these same people completed an implicit bias test, those healthcare workers demonstrated significant preference favoring white Americans, while their perceptions of Black African Americans were negative relative to cooperation with medical procedures. The study also found that the more physicians were implicitly biased towards white people, the more likely they were to perform certain treatments on white patients in comparison to Black African Americans. So through these examples, through the book that I hope many of you have read, and if you haven't read it, please do, what you will be able to see is systemic racism is endemic in this country. We didn't get where we are by accident. The long history of abuses that Ida Mae, George, and Robert attempted to escape from the South sadly still exists. They couldn't run far enough because the specter of systemic racism followed them all the way to the North, to the Midwest and to the West, and it's still following us today. George Floyd's death opened the floodgate of emotion and anger, but it's the years of abuse in every institution of this country that we're seeing protested now. It's that floodgate that is open. Now, in conclusion, I'm going to ask you to remember that what we're facing down is a system, a nebulous web that operates in the background of every institution. It's not a simple continuum of good people versus bad people. If it were that easy, we would just, be able to, maybe we would be able to fix that. But actually, all of the institutions of this country are full of benign, well-meaning people just like you, just like me, but they're still part of the system that propagates the ills of systemic racism in America. Now, I would contend one way to begin addressing the problem is best stated by Ijoya Oluma, who says, quote, "When we acknowledge racism as part of a system, instead of being limited to our ability to win over racists, we can instead focus on how our actions interact with systemic racism." Or as my motto states, systemic racism, see it, say it, confront it. So I appreciate your listening. I know there's time for someone else to take the reins. So I'm going to pass this session over to Elaine.
Carol, thank you so much for this wonderful, enlightening words about what went on in our country that we never learn about in school. As a first generation American, a child of parents who left Europe for a better life, I can't imagine living in your own country and having to flee for a better life. So my first question to you is, in what ways are Ida Mae and George and Robert representatives of the millions of other migrants who journeyed from the South to the North?
I appreciate that question because I told you earlier that I had a migration story in my own family. And so it gives me an opportunity to answer that question through my family. Ida Mae, George, and Robert represent, if you are African-American and Black and grew up in this country and have relatives who grew up in the South, they represent our history. And they represent all of the people who made that choice. My grandparents, grandmother and grandfather migrated from South Carolina. And I did not realize what a major undertaking that was for them. They moved to Steelton, Pennsylvania for work. What happened is my grandfather was fed up with the system, the racist, horrible conditions in South Carolina. And he talked with my grandmother and they agreed that he would go ahead and find a job, find a place to live. Even though he farmed for a living, he figured he could find some kind of work, which he did in the steel mill. And he worked for a while there and then sent back for my grandmother and my mother, who at the time was 7 years old. And they made their migration north. They would have been part of that first group. There were 3 waves of migrants. There was the early group that came in the 20s and 30s, which would represent Ida Mae. And then the next group, George Starling's group, and then Robert Pershing. So each one of those individuals represent the 3 different time periods over the 70 years when people were migrating north.
Sorry. Carol, how did the Great Migration change not only the North, but the South? And with that question, how did the South respond to the mass exodus of cheap, black labor, or we should say free black labor.
Basically, yeah, it was basically free. Well, the Southerners reacted like anybody else would who had a business and was concerned about losing their labor force. The people in the South, they took very, very, very strong action to discourage folks. If you've read the book, one of my favorite, it's not favorite because it's good, but one of my favorite illustrations is when people had actually boarded the train. When I say people, Black African Americans who were trying to go north, they had boarded the train. They were going north. They stopped the train before it could get much further, ordered all the Black African Americans off the train and tore up their tickets. Now that tells you how serious people took it, that people were leaving the South. Also, in the South, when Northerners came South during the 20s and 30s, and especially in the 40s during wartime, when laborers were needed in the North to work in the factories and to keep the system, the factories running for wartime, recruiters would come South and try to recruit people to come North to work. And those recruiters were sometimes they were beaten, sometimes they were threatened, and many times they were levied very large. Our day would amount to maybe like $25,000 to be allowed to come South and recruit laborers. Now in the North, what changed is that cities became more crowded because unfortunately, Black African Americans, they were starting to be segregated into neighborhoods where they had to live, several people in an apartment and so on. But some positive things, a lot of positive things came out of it. People that probably, if they hadn't left the South, we may not know about them. Performers like Aretha Franklin, individuals who came North to start businesses and so on. So the North benefited tremendously. The South saw it as being stripped of their labor force.
Thank you, Carol. The next question is, in what ways was the Great Migration of Southern Blacks similar to other historical migrations? And in what important ways was it unique?
Well, I think the way it's similar is, again, I think if all of us go back and talk to our families and the elders in our families, what we will find is that many made the choice to move somewhere for the betterment of their family. And we still see that now. We see that with the immigration efforts that of people coming from Central America, trying to make their way to America. That is typical of what we see down through history, that people move. They are going to go somewhere when things are not right where they are, or when they believe things can be better somewhere else. Now, again, what made the Great Migration so different is most times people are leaving one country to go to another country. The Great Migration was literally, it was as if the South was one country and people were leaving to go to another country, which was the North, the Midwest, and the West. And in essence, they weren't leaving their country. They were in their own country trying to escape situations that were just abhorrent. So that's what makes it different. Most times you'll see migration from one country to another as opposed to within a country. The other thing that made it different is that, well, I won't say different, it's similar. These individuals, these 6 million people who were leaving, most of them were leaving under threat of violence, under threat of death, whether it be literally being lynched or violence as a result of poor health care and poor nutrition. So the movement is not unusual. The fact that it was movement within a country is what made it so odd.
A follow-up to that was the blacks, the migration was from the south to the north. Was that different and for different reasons when the people went from the east to the west and went across the great country to travel by wagon to get to California and Arizona and New Mexico?
You know, that's a good question, Elaine. I think that when we saw that kind of movement and that kind of settlement, you have to remember that was a lot of that was underwritten by the government. The United States wanted the unsettled territories to be populated. And by populating those territories, that was a way to ensure that, one, the country would expand, and that the country could retain control over those lands, because now there would be Americans living there. So that's the big difference for me, that these were underwritten. Think of the land rushes that happened, where the government said, hey, we'll give you X amount of land if you settle in these new territories, and if you can rush out there quickly and stake your claim. But that was definitely not the case for Black African Americans. The intention was they were trying to get out of the South, and nobody was particularly helping them.
Thank you. Karen?
Yes, the three families in the Warmth of Other Sons had very different experiences in their migration. How much of that do you believe was a function of where they migrated to, and how much was a function of their level of education?
Well, I think it played in, both played into it. You know, Dr. Robert Foster went west, and the fact that he was a physician, a trained medical physician, and he was able to move someplace where there were large populations of African Americans who needed medical care, and also people who had settled there that knew him, that gave him a leg up. Now, in Ida Mae's case, she moved to Chicago, and Chicago was and is notoriously segregated. And so, again, she was uneducated. And so the fact of being able to get a job, a higher paying job, or into, you know, a job for less, the people with skills of her nature, climbing up was going to be difficult. But at the same time, she and her husband were living in a city that was very stratified. And if you know your history, a number of race confrontations happened there, housing issues, mass, you know, just overall, Chicago was a very untenable place to live.
Are the pressures that caused these families to migrate still present? And are there differences in different areas of the US?
Well, I think the pressures to look for something better, those pressures definitely still exist. Whether or not people are going to move back and forth around the country to find that relief is a question. Now, one thing that we did see, it has slowed down, but we did see in, I'd say maybe like the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, people actually started to migrate back. And when I say people, African American Blacks started moving back to the South. Some of them had relatives and property and land still in the South, and they saw that as an opportunity to move back and to take some level of control of their own destiny by going somewhere where they had roots in a way, and also to be able to, in the New South, as they called it then, in the New South, to be able to make something of themselves. I don't know if Tyler Perry is a good example of this, but I'm going to throw it out. But Tyler Perry has his major studio in Atlanta. He does not produce his television shows and his movies in Hollywood per se. He finds or found that going south or staying south was a plus because of the incentives that were offered to him. And also the irony is that he bought an old, what had been a Confederate camp and used that Confederate camp to open his film studio. So it's kind of an interesting twist of fate and a turn of irony.
Carol,
As a follow-up to that question is, the blacks that moved north were subjected to the same kind of racism, but in a different form from whites up north. What happened when they encountered the American Indians, if they went west?
Well, it just depended. Sometimes they were in fact, one of the books that we're going to be reading is about African Americans who moved west and how they were part of the pioneering spirit. Sometimes there were alliances made among and between Black African Americans and Indian Native Americans. Sometimes, just like we see in the old cowboy and Indian movies, there was animosity and things did not go well between the groups. So I can't say there was a monolith that said, everybody got along and, sang kumbaya, but there were instances where the groups did come together and they worked together, but also instances where they did not. A lot of the westward movement, historically, a lot of the westward movement for African Americans and I'm not going to throw out the date because I don't have my books right in front of me and I don't want to just, give you something, but I do know that when what was considered at one time the Northwest in America, which was actually Illinois, I want to say Indiana, Ohio, at one time that was considered America's Northwest, and it was not highly settled. And so at one time, a number of Black African Americans actually went to that territory, and they had thousands of acres of land, thousands and thousands of acres of land that they farmed, that they developed, because no one was there pretty much to stop them. But as the westward expansion continued, and that no longer was the frontier, then again, African Americans began to be pushed off their land, and there were land grabs, and they lost some of the gains that they had. Now, I want to add too, Elaine, that moving north didn't solve problems at all. One of the things that one of the situations that Black African Americans faced on a regular basis when they tried to move into neighborhoods that were considered off limits to them, they could buy a home, and when whites found out about it, they descended on those homes, wrecked the homes. For example, Dr. Sweet is a good example in Detroit in the 1920s. He was a very well-educated gentleman, and he and his wife bought a home in a part of Detroit that was all white. Well, the night that they moved in, about 2,000 white people descended on the house, throwing rocks and, basically tearing the house apart. Somebody fired a shot into the crowd, a white person was killed, and immediately, even though the Sweet family was being accosted, and the Sweet family was the group that was being set upon, they were arrested. All 7 of the people in the house were arrested, and they were held without bail and without any kind of support until the NAACP hired Clarence Darrow to defend them. And the situation, it ended in a positive as you can be. They never were able to occupy the home. That was a moot point, but they were freed. Unfortunately, Dr. Sweet's wife contracted tuberculosis while she was in prison, and she in turn gave that to their daughter, and they both died. And then several years later, Dr. Sweet actually committed suicide. So moving north had its advantages, but it definitely had its disadvantages. I could go on and on. I'll wait till the next question, and then maybe I'll add to it.
Let me repeat that. What is the impact today of housing and educational systems on Black families?
I'm glad you asked that, especially about education. Interestingly enough, right after the Civil War, so I'm going to give just a little bit of a history of education. Right after the Civil War, Black African Americans, it seemed to be out of nowhere, opened schools. And there was white missionaries had descended to the South. They were going to come and bring education to the sad and downtrodden enslaved people. Well, when they got there, they were surprised to find out that these downtrodden enslaved people weren't so downtrodden and enslaved that, well, they had been enslaved and they had been downtrodden, but they were not necessarily in need of a school, because many of them had been operating underground schools for many years. And so once the Civil War was over and they were freed, they immediately opened schools. And churches opened them, independent people opened them. They basically said, hey, the best way to move up and be part of this American enterprise is to be educated. And so they started schools. Well, at the same time, then when the white missionaries came south, they said, okay, well, we'll start some schools too. So there were the church-run schools, the independent schools, and then the white-run missionary schools that were going on. Well, I think we know that one of the best ways to subjugate people is through education. And so this whole business, this enterprise of education was actually subverted by Northern industrialists, Northern philanthropists, and Southern planters. What they did was they started to support education that would subjugate Black people. So for example, as much as I admire the work of Booker T. Washington, as much as I know that he worked on behalf of Black African Americans, his whole model was actually kind of contorted in a way that helped to keep Black African Americans subservient. He believed in what was called industrial education. Learn to work with your hands, learn carpentry, learn husbandry, farming. I mean, a lot of the things that slaves already knew how to do, but he said, hey, let's make this their enterprise, and that's where they belong. And Northern industrialists and philanthropists thought, hey, and the planters, they thought, hey, this is a good thing. So they threw their money behind him. And they also figured out ways to help stamp out the schools that were run by Black African Americans and the missionaries, because these schools, a lot of these schools were not interested, the people who ran those schools, they weren't interested in teaching industrial education. They actually wanted to teach classical education, much like what the Northern children were learning. And so it was a struggle. It was a struggle between the two. Well, the one that won out was the subjugation of Blacks through education. So today, fast forward to today, where are we today? What we have seen is that the curriculum, the material, the information, the funding, all of the things that go into making strong schools, those things are within the bailiwick and the purview mainly of those in the white mainstream. Schools that serve predominantly African-American and Black students, although they do as good a job as they possibly can, they are underfunded oftentimes. And why are they underfunded? Because schools are funded by property taxes. So if a school or a school district is in an area that has no or very low property values, and so the taxation does not bring in the kind of money that can build, large and very important or large schools and attract teachers with excellent salaries, then we run into the problem of poor education, possibly poor education for that group. Also, after Brown v. Board of Education, which declared segregating schools unconstitutional, it's interesting that parents and leaders of schools rushed to figure out ways to resegregate. A couple of ways that they did this: they started private schools, they homeschooled, they moved to the suburbs. In the North, they ignored the busing, or they fought against busing. The most famous incident that I refer to is in Prince George's County in Virginia, that actually closed their schools for 5 years. 5 years. And they took the state money and funneled it to private schools where all white students attended. And they did not provide any education, nothing for those 5 years for the Black African American students. And the result was, within that 5-year time, the literacy rate for Black African Americans went from 3% to 23, or the illiteracy rate, I should say, went from 3% to 23%. So what we see today is the same situation of resegregation, the move to separate schools. Sometimes you go to a school where the claim is, well, we're an integrated school, we have all types of students here, and you might go down the hall and you'll see a classroom that has all African American students in it, and then another classroom that has maybe just a sprinkling of them. So a lot is going on in education. We need to take a look at it. And I say, again, see it, say it, confront it.
You answered a question that we just got asked about resegregation. Thank you.
No, but I have another follow-up that's not in the chat, that came via text. We've talked about discrimination in the workplace. We've talked about it in education. We've talked about it in housing. What about the military? And was it different when we were at war versus when we're not at war?
Well, that's a good question. And I will confess, I don't have the statistics and the data that I would like to have to be able to share with you. But I do know from personal experience that the military was segregated up until the years of Harry Truman, who declared that the military had to desegregate. Now, my personal experience is my father fought in World War II, and he told stories, he shared stories with us about being segregated as an enlisted man. And the jobs that he had were clearly the subservient jobs. They were expected to be cooks. They could dig ditches or latrines and so on. But as far as expecting all African-American men who were part of the military at that time to participate fully, and as you would expect other soldiers to do, that was not the expectation. Now, over time, the military actually has become a great leveler. It is a place where people, African Americans, can go into the service and they can rise through the ranks and eventually achieve great things in the military. So as an institution, it is one that I won't say there is no systemic racism, but because of the way it's structured and the expectations for service are strictly outlined, systemic racism per se, you do not, it may be less, but it is there. And you may find instances of bias and prejudice and individual racism in the military. But again, I have not researched that as deeply as I would like. So I'm speaking more from conjecture and personal experience.
Thank you. Now, the next question is probably what everybody wants an answer to. Can you explain the difference between Black Lives Matter and the concept of Black Lives Matter, and why we should support the movement as opposed to the organization?
Well, I will sum it up in a very simple statement. I am Black and I matter. And I hope you believe that. I do not belong to an organization called Black Lives Matter. I'm familiar with it. I've looked at their website, and it exists. But conceptually, the idea of Black Lives Matter is very simple. People who are Black African Americans have been murdered, abused, tortured, a myriad of things I could run through have been done to Black people in this country. And it's still going on. And it matters that people should do something about it. Now, the fact that there's an organization that exists called Black Lives Matter that perhaps has some philosophical or theoretical ideas and ideals that someone doesn't agree with, I understand that. There are organizations, there are a lot of organizations like that. In fact, there are a lot of organizations that are run by and are on behalf of Black African Americans that I would not join. But the fact of the matter is, an organization is irrelevant as far as I'm concerned when it comes to worrying about, working on behalf of, and doing away with the systemic racism that consistently disadvantages and kills Black people. That's what we're talking about when we say Black Lives Matter. Now, if you don't like the organization, fine. I don't particularly, and like I said, I don't belong and don't plan to belong. But the fact of this, of what is going on, when you see people out with signs up and marching in the streets and saying Black Lives Matter, I would say the majority of those people don't even have a clue that there's an organization called that, or if they do, they're not concerned about it. What they are walking around with signs and making a point about is that Black people are being murdered at an unconscionable rate in this country. Black people are being mistreated and disabused at an unconscionable rate in this country. And it has been going on for decades, and it should stop. And that's what Black Lives Matter is to me. I am Black and I matter. And I hope that the people that have any sense of decency, any sense of morality, any sense of ethics would say, I understand that and I support it. So that's the best I can tell you. If you don't want to support the organization, go forth and do that. But if you think ethically, morally, it is the right thing to do to support any Black person who is trying to stay alive in this country, then you are supporting Black Lives Matter as a concept.
Thank you. Karen?
We have been asked for you to talk a little bit about systemic racism and voting.
I'm sorry, Karen, you kind of cut off there.
Sorry. We have been asked about systemic racism and voting.
Okay, good
There's
question. Good question.
others.
Well, let's go back to history. Let's go back to history. Black African Americans have long been disenfranchised and disenfranchised of the vote. Go back to the poll taxes, when in order to be able to vote, you had to pay money. Well, if you're a sharecropper or somebody who's barely making ends meet, having money to pay a poll tax, probably not going to happen. The whole idea of sometimes even, again, back in history, people were expected to recite the Declaration of Independence or some passage from the Constitution. These are examples of disenfranchisement. These are examples of trying to keep people not to vote. Now, there are extreme examples and there are obvious examples, but let's kind of fast forward to today. This whole business of telling people or discouraging people to vote by mail, to do an absentee ballot, which is really what we're talking about, that is an effort to disenfranchise. To say that sheriffs and law enforcement will be sent to the polls to keep order, that's a form of disenfranchisement. telling people that it's possible that your vote will not count if you do X, Y, or Z. That is a form of disenfranchisement. So taking people off the rolls of the voting rolls at the last minute, or even now purging the voting rolls, telling people that if they go to the polls that it's unsafe to go there. These are ways and methods that have been used and are being used today to keep people from voting. Now, how you vote is your business. I mean, when you get in there, it's between you and whatever you're using, the computer or so on. But the threat is that the vote will be for or against somebody that others would prefer to be in office or not be in office. But I would say, I get a chuckle, and it's not chuckling because it's funny, because it's irony. That's what I'm chuckling at. But today, all Americans are actually experiencing what Black African Americans have always experienced when it comes to elections. We have always had to figure out ways to make sure our vote is counted. Now it's everybody. I'll tell you a little story about my own neighborhood. I just happened to drive by. No, I saw it on our neighborhood Facebook page. Someone said, "Did you know that the mailboxes are no longer outside our neighborhood post office?" And I thought, whoa, that's unusual. So I made a trip over there to see. And sure enough, both sets of mailboxes were gone. Well, that's kind of odd, because I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years, and those mailboxes have always been there. Now, when we have a contentious election and the possibility that a lot of people will be mailing in their ballots, suddenly the mailboxes are gone. So this has happened in neighborhoods for Black people all the time. We happen to live in a predominantly white neighborhood, and the shock was, shock of shocks, this is being done to us. But I want to tell you, it's been done to Black African Americans forever. So there I have it. I've babbled on. Ask me another question.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions, and I have one that I think we're all interested in. Is it appropriate to make parallels between the Jewish experience and other oppressed people's experience?
I think it's important for everyone to own their own experience. Now, are there parallels? Are there ways that we coincide and intersect? Absolutely. But I don't want to dilute anybody's experience by trying to say, well, but look at this. This happened to me, or this happened to this group or that group. Every group should own their own situations, and where we can see the intersection to maybe work together to overcome things that are affecting both of us that intersect, let's work together. Let's get together on it. But the reason I'm not saying let's keep apart. What I'm saying is let's respect what has happened to each group. And by respecting that, we are saying each group deserves their honor. Each group deserves to be handled and respected with care. And each group has something to bring that's important to this tapestry of America. Now, can those groups work together to get stuff done? Absolutely. Let's work together and get things done. Has there been, have Jewish people been disabused, abused, persecuted, violence committed against them? Absolutely. Is that wrong? You bet. Same thing for Native Americans. Same thing for people of Asian American descent, and so on. So what I say is that let's honor and respect the fact that these things have been done to each of these groups, and know what they were and what they are. And then let's work together to fight systemic racism. But let's not dilute anybody's experience by saying one is more important than the other.
Carol, I have one short question and one that I don't know if you even want to take this because it's huge and everyone wants to know. So the short question is, someone said they noticed you using the term Black African Americans. Is that the most appropriate term to use right now?
I'm glad you asked that. I only do that because I know within our community, some people like to be called Black, some people like to be called African American, some people don't want to be called anything. But I just basically say them together out of respect for somebody listening and hearing. I mean, I've gone back and forth, I don't remember. I remember when I was little, my mom and dad would talk about being colored, but I lived past that and I became Black. But then as we moved on, then it became African American. So I can't honestly say what I would suggest. If you have friends or you're in the circle of folks who happen to look like me, ask them what they want to be called. But I purposely choose to say Black African American because I know what goes on in the community.
Here's the long one, and I don't know if you can answer this succinctly, but everyone wants to know, what can we do to address systemic racism?
It is the long one. It is the long one, but it actually is the short one. And I will give you the short answer. Each one of us has a sphere of influence. You belong to a synagogue. You belong to a bridge club. You go to an exercise group. You work for a business. You go to some kind of organization. Where I'm going with this is we all have this sphere of influence that we function in. And that's where you start to confront it. You see it there, you say it there, and you confront it there. You're at the dinner table and somebody makes an off-color remark. Don't ignore it, confront it. You run a business or you work for a business and you know that there are certain policies or practices, usually not policies because now we don't write it down that we're discriminating, but maybe there are some practices that you know that company is doing that are not appropriate. They are definitely discriminatory. Speak up. And I know it's tough because that's going to put you in the position of being the bad guy because you're pointing out stuff that, shouldn't be going on. But the short answer, Karen, is you see it, you say it, and you confront it where you are. We can't take on the world. I'm seeing it and saying it, confronting it through Why Are They So Angry? Whenever my niece and I do a podcast, I feel like, hey, somebody's out there is going to hear this and maybe it's going to, the message is going to sink in and they're going to change. But I'm not going to go up against, remember what I said, it's a system, not a person. If somebody has racist ideas and, they live next door to me, I'm not going next door to confront that person, trust me. But if there's a realtor who says, I can't buy a house someplace, or they're secretly steering Black people away from certain neighborhoods, I'm going to confront that. I can deal with that. But if I've got a racist neighborhood, hey, no neighbor, c'est la vie. So my long answer is, look at your sphere of influence. What's going on there? And confront systemic racism where you are. We can't take on the world, but take on that little space where you are.
Wow.
Thank you, Carol. I just want to say, I know Elaine has to close this up real quickly, but we are going to put a list of the books that you have recommended on our Facebook page. So if people want to read, it's going to be there.
Good. And if I might add, feel free to come to our website, www.whyaretheysoangry.com. And we're offering a course now. I can't believe how all this stuff has come together. It's only been 3 months and I'm doing an online course. So if you go to our website, there's another place you can get some information if you want to take the course. So we'd love to have you.
Thank you.
So much to
All right.
think about. Thank you. Dasa?
Yes, Carol, as co-VP of Public Affairs, I want, with Linda Donsky, and on behalf of the NCJW Dallas section, we would like to thank you for leading our discussion on this important topic. We are ever grateful to you for helping us understand why they are so angry. And so it is with great appreciation, we would like to present you with an e-certificate to Interabank Bookstore here in Dallas, where you can pick out a book of your choice to add to your terrific library. Thank you again.
Yes, the library the stack is getting really tall, but I can add to it. I can definitely add to it.
There are never too few books. So thank you again. And Elaine, you have some parting words for us?
I do. Thank you all for coming. This was an amazing program. There will be many more to come this year. We hope to see you all at our next meeting, which will be announced shortly. If you are not a member of NCJW and you enjoyed this program this morning, please join us because we have a lot more to do and we have a lot more to help in this community. As Carol said, we have our own sphere, we each have our own sphere of influence and how we can make change in our own little way. It's baby steps, one foot in front of the other to make this our little corner of the world a better place to live. Thank you all for coming and we'll see you next time.
Bye.